Okay, we'll start. Please take your seats. Vitor, take your seat. Vitor, please take your seat. Thank you. Order. Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to the EIBA Fellows Plenary this morning. We have a special guest with us, Professor Michael Storper of UCLA and the LSE. I've certainly cited Michael and used his work for a very long time, and I think many of us have. There's been, in a sense, a kind of parallel literature in economic geography that's also been interested in international business issues, going back over a fairly long period of time, and in regional science as well, regional studies and urban studies. And so we'll have an opportunity this morning to reflect on some of that literature as well, I think. And after Michael speaks, it will be Simona Iammarino, and then I will come back, and then Lucia Piscitello will close the opening part of our discussion. But I'd just like to say that, I think the intersection between economic geography and international business is proving to be a very fruitful one. With the help of Ram Madambi especially, we've kind of reached out as an international business community to economic geography, and I think we've begun now to build some bridges, and so I think it's especially appropriate that we have Michael as our visitor and guest and honoree for today's discussion. And he's certainly a very worthwhile, and we're very pleased and honoured to have him with us this morning. So Michael's going to open up our discussion, and we'll give him the opportunity also to respond to any comments or discussion that there might be, or indeed to the other panellists that will follow him. So Michael, over to you. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank you, thank John, thank the organizers for inviting me. It's an honor. I'm not an international business scholar. I'm an economic geographer, so it's particularly rewarding to have the opportunity to share what we do in economic geography and think about the intersections between different fields. And it's always nice to know that someone reads you beyond your own little narrow field in academia, right? We always get this feeling that, we're in our little community. So I think this is a great opportunity. So thank you all once again. I'm really honored. So what I want to do in really briefly here is just share with you some thoughts about about some of my current interest in economic geography, and and offer some ideas about how we might frame some questions that could also perhaps be of interest to people studying international business. And the framework that I'm currently exploring has to do with the way the economy changes over time and some of the major drivers of change from one period to another. So here are some stylized facts, and I'm thinking in terms of these periods in the economy that we can put numbers on them, although it's hard to put precise numbers, but they're periods that are defined by major ensembles of technology. Many other people, of course, in the innovation and technology studies field have explored these ideas, and in the innovation studies area have explored these ideas in the last few decades. Many people who have defined this way of thinking. So let me just sort of suggest that we could think about a previous period, which we might call the Second Industrial Revolution, whose general purpose technologies were mechanical engineering, electricity, and fossil fuels. And here's the economic geography twist on it, though. That twist is that over that roughly century-long period, you can divide it into two phases from the standpoint of the geographical distribution of income, meaning that in the first phase, per capita incomes diverge between regions, and they concentrate in certain major cities from roughly 1880 to 1940. And then there's a convergence phase. The convergence phase is where that revolutions firms and technology spread out, and with it, they bring an evening of the landscape in terms of economic welfare, notably in terms of income, and the distribution of different groups, different skilled groups in the labor force. And that's, that 1940 to 1980 phase holds a powerful grip on a lot of our imaginations, or at least it does of people of my generation, because we were raised to think. And a lot of the models that I got taught when I was a graduate student were based on that period, without understanding that it was a specific period and not the way that capitalism functions in general. That's the amendment. And the amendment comes because after 1980, there's a third industrial revolution based on general purpose technologies of ICT, finance, biosciences, and the explosion of luxury and variety. And basically what it does is usher in a very strong divergence phase, meaning that incomes become increasingly different between regions within countries at the same time that there's a global spread of development. But even inside the spread process into successful emerging countries, the incomes are largely concentrated in metropolitan areas, and interregional differences in income also grow in those places. And that is reflected in lots of results in economic geography. What we call the metropolitan size premium has radically increased. The skilled wage premium has radically increased. Geographical gaps in the skilled wage premium increase, meaning you take the same person with the same skills, they're going to earn much more in cities today than they do in other areas, and that wasn't true in the pre-1980 period. This is true everywhere in the world, although Europe has a slightly flatter metropolitan hierarchy. And like I said, globalization makes this a worldwide process. So this is some work that I've been doing with Tom Kemeny on using U.S. data, and where we've broken down the U.S. into these very small travel to work areas or commuting zones. And what you see there is very clearly the 1980 inflection point. You see the Gini coefficient on wages dropping from 1940 to 1980 for all segments of the workforce, and then it just takes off, it takes off for all workers, but especially the red line is those who are skilled, or we're proxying that with college educated. And note the difference between the red and the green lines, because the wages for unskilled people are flattening across regions, and they're diverging for the skilled. This, so what you see in blue there, so this is the share of college educated workers in different areas in America. So we've scaled them according to size. We've scaled up from commuting zones to metropolitan areas. They're scaled according to size. And basically what you see is that in the 1940 to 1980 period, the growth rate of more skilled people didn't depend on how many skilled people you had there before that. But since 1980, there's a cumulative effect of the more skilled people you have, the more skilled people you get. So we're seeing this very sharp divergence. It is true of the workforce in general. There is, of course, an extreme upper tail phenomenon, meaning, the top 1% and all the things we talk about. But whether or not you include the top 1%, which does have it has a distorting effect, because the top 1% concentrate in what we call the superstar cities, and they have an extreme effect on their incomes. But it's not driven by that. It's driven by the skilled in general. This is what's important in this figure. The other thing, of course, that it animates huge debates within economic geography and urban and regional economics is this a real divergence, or is it basically all canceled out by housing costs and other costs of living? And the answer is it's not canceled out by housing costs. That skilled people, in spite of what we think, that you go to London or New York and you have a high nominal wage, but it all goes away in your housing, it's not true. Not at least for the average skilled worker in those cities. they are more than, I know this comes as a shock, they are more than able to pay for their housing costs. And indeed, if we were to price in their amenities, they have real utility levels that are much higher than people in other regions and are sharply diverging from them. Here's the other, of course, striking fact of our age, which is that the prosperity and inequality now go together, meaning the most prosperous places are increasingly the most internally unequal ones, whereas prior to 1980, that wasn't true. There was a weak or maybe even non-existent relationship between the per capita income or hourly wages of a place, of a city or region, at least in the American case, prior to 1980, between that and the inequality of that place. But today, they are joined at the hip. So more prosperous, more unequal, because, of course, the prosperity is getting driven by the spatial concentration of the skilled and the increasing premiums paid to people who are skilled in the places where they're concentrated that are diverging from the places where other skilled people go. Now, this is a different data set because at least using American data, we can't get the detailed data prior to 1940. So we have to proxy something for the previous period. And what we did here, I won't get too detailed in a short talk like this, is we considered that the second industrial revolution was manufacturing based, and that manufacturing workers at the beginning of that, in what was basically less urbanized, more agricultural economies, that they could be a proxy for who was skilled at that time in the late 19th century. And what you see there is in the various series that we have calculated there, which is workers and output and wages and capital and the wage bill, that there is this cyclical movement of the rise of spatial unevenness of that revolution, and that corresponds to what historians of urbanization tell us. It generated a powerful network of highly industrial manufacturing cities. That concentration lasted roughly, with ups and downs, into the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century, and then in the post-Second World War period, the second industrial revolution spatially diffused. And that's the convergence phase of 1940 to 1980, is that it's the old industrial revolution maturing, getting older, and basically dispersing itself across space. So this is mirrored in lots of other ways of thinking about economic geography, notably in the geography of innovation and patenting, where we are seeing an extreme concentration of patenting in metropolitan centers today, even as it spreads to more countries. But it spreads through what our team at LSE called hotspots. All right, so you've got global spread, but local hotspots as the architecture of the geography of innovation. And innovation sector is a high-wage, high-skilled sector. So it goes exactly in line with the kind of wage and income data that we have. Okay, so this third industrial revolution, of course, looks in some ways that the third industrial revolution thus far, which is a revolution that is about spatial economic divergence. It looks in many ways to me very similar to the first phase of the second industrial revolution, meaning that it coincides with a strong period of globalization, with very strong urbanization, and with the growth of spatial economic inequalities. Now, of course, there are some differences as you all know, in the form that globalization takes. In the second industrial revolution, the globalization was basically based on linking faraway consumers to different points of production in the global economy. Today, of course, it's the rise of intra-industry trade and intricate global value chains. And today, those intricate global value chains are clearly part of the story of spreading income across the globe. But they participate at the regional level in the hollowing out of routine jobs in developed countries, notably those that are associated with the second industrial revolution or with the more, we might say, routine production tasks of the third industrial revolution. And these regional shocks enhance income divergence effect that we're living through today. So we might say, as a sort of a first bridge between economic geography and business studies, that multinational enterprises, as knowledge-seeking, logistics managing organizations, they are very probably reinforcing the income divergence that we see between regions, even as they participate in the spread of global capitalism and the spread of income to many developed countries. So they're part of these functional agglomerations that are the metropolitan structure of prosperity today. They are participants in these ecologies or agglomerations. Now, there are some interesting outliers that I try to think about, and probably some of you have studied these and know more a lot about them. I keep thinking about sort of outliers like global companies in improbable regions like Zara, IKEA, or Walmart, which are these kind of world-class companies. I don't know how much we can generalize from them or how much they're like, I think Walmart seems to me at least like a kind of cathedral in the desert because it's administering this kind of global distribution chain, but doesn't have, Little Rock, Arkansas is not by any means a global superstar metropolis, even though it has a superstar company. So there's going to be some outliers here, and Zara, of course, with its endogenous local production chain. And there are maybe some other cases that we would need to expand to in trying to think about how the geography of incomes and development relate to the geography of different kinds of industries and value chains, like resource industries and tourism and travel. But I think that the bottom line is that when we look into different industries, we almost always find today this two-sided or split geography, meaning you've got the innovation and control functions of these companies that are tapping into these skilled agglomerations with the vast array of resources that they have in terms of innovation, management, and the very, very top of the kind of logistics and supply chain. And then you've got the routine functions that are following some logic ranging from standard comparative advantage to things that are dictated by, for example, natural resources or natural and humanly constructed resources. On balance, the geography of multinationals is participating in the intermetropolitan divergence process, but the global spread of incomes. Now, how does economic geography come at this? It's sort of already implicit in what I've said. We think about two kinds of revolutions. One is what you might call a Smithian revolution in trade and transport costs, meaning they redefine the geography of comparative advantages and market areas, and each revolution has its particular way of extending the ability to manage production chains across space and to define market areas. But on top of that, you get what we might call these periodic or Schumpeterian revolutions, which are these, they define the content of each period. These are these general purpose technologies like manufacturing in the second and ICT and finance in the third. And they concentrate the key skilled functions until their technologies mature. So there's a paradox that we identify in economic geography. It's one of the core sort of micro findings of our field, which is that even though the Smithian revolutions, what they do is they make trade and transport costs cheaper, right? But they superlinearly decline. So that's the globalization story. But unit trade and transport costs for the key functions in these chains, they actually rise. And that's because there's a feedback to innovation, product variety, and complexity that regenerates the metropolitan phenomenon even in a world of trade and transport costs that are unimaginably low by comparison to most of human history. And that was a debate that we had about 15 or 20 years ago when everybody predicted the death of distance, and instead what we got was more cities and more density. And so it's the relationship between the two that is actually quite complex and has this feedback mechanism in it. So International business is, of course, affected by both of these. It's affected by the Smithian revolution that enables the spread, but it's also constrained by the Schumpeterian revolution that requires these companies to concentrate in these places with very dense agglomerations and very high unit trade and transaction costs. Now, that's sort of the micro part of it, but I want to raise, really in concluding, I want to raise some broader issues. Simona's going to come to this, so I'm not going to say much about it, but I think a really big issue that's sort of floating over the field today is the nature of markets. And I will say no more than except to say that my esteemed colleague is going to tell you about that shortly. But I want to go even wider now. And this is maybe a bit risk-taking, but let's try it anyway. There are political economy questions that are emerging in this phase of globalization. I'm gonna channel Branko Milanovic here a bit, and he argues, I think very powerfully, that there is a key inbuilt feature of contemporary globalization is an increase in the rents to corruption. Because what we're seeing is a mixture of highly regulated economies with much less regulated countries' business systems. So when you mix a super, like a Nordic economy with an economy from some other part of the world where there's a kind of a less established rule system, what happens is that there's a massive increase in incentives for international business or for anybody to engage in corruption, because basically you can arbitrage between different rule systems. And it's rising in spite of older legislation to try and control it, like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which dates from the 1970s in America. And of course, as we know, tax avoidance has become a huge global sector today. And it's grown with globalization. And, it's not the only participant, but international business is a key participant in legal tax avoidance and in a few cases, illegal tax evasion, sanctions evasion, money laundering, and so on. And we're having scandal after scandal break out, and Milanovic, I think, argues that this isn't accidental, that we're seeing it as a feature of this phase of globalization. And so there's a new storm over the multinationals, and I think we have to take stock of that. And that's not only because of the social environmental concerns of the liberal democratic societies, like the climate change issue and all kinds of debates about people's rights, but in spite of the enormous PR efforts by international business to position themselves as constructive problem solvers, there's kind of like a mismatch between how the public perceives international business and what international business is trying to create as its image. And there are other things like CEO compensation and private equity. And so from an economic geographer standpoint, the root sources of this are the potent combination of globalization and the third industrial revolution, bringing together parts of the world that simply there's just a lot of spaces for all kinds of arbitraging behavior that result from a non-uniform global rule system. And I think we should do a lot more on that. And it's a great intersection of our fields. And I want to go further to draw this together. We in the West, up till now, have largely assumed that the globalization regime of the third industrial revolution would be dominated by the rules that would be set down by the liberal, meritocratic, capitalist countries, with a significant degree of separation of power of the state and private business, and a significant, although incomplete, flawed, often vulnerable, transparency of rules and an emphasis on preventing formal corruption while allowing significant private power, right? So it's supposed to be, in its ideal representation of itself, if not in reality, a rules-based regime, right? But let's be honest, in parts of the world today, a different form of capitalism is emerging, right? Let's call it, I'm adopting Milanovic's terminology, but there's different phrases that are out there, I think, as we try to figure this out. We might call it political capitalism. We might call it illiberal capitalism, but it has different attributes. First of all, there's a much more fluid relationship of states to markets and companies. It's not based on the Western tradition of markets that are regulated with a powerful antitrust regime. Centralized power tends to be the rule in these countries rather than something like democracy with internal rivalries between the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. So that means that the centralized power agents, whoever they are, can bend the rules and have a subordinate judiciary to do it. So the rule of law concept that we all adopt, at least coming from the West, it just doesn't mean the same thing across the world today. Power is generally in the hands in the most successful countries of the centralized bureaucratic classes, and they deliver on growth, but liberal proceduralism, meaning the ability to exercise within a rights-based framework and transparency and what we would call Western freedoms, they're basically not the priority of the system. And the tendency of all this, of course, is to create a high degree of internal corruption that requires regular purges and efforts to clean it up and get growth going again. It's more successful, this is more successful in China, less successful in places like Russia or Turkey or the resource-rich countries. So there's a variation in how the illiberal and political regimes unfold. They're not totally homogeneous. So we might think about this as a problem or an opportunity for research on international business. If there's a liberal meritocratic capitalism, and I'm not trying to make value judgments, let's just be analytical and descriptive here, and a political, semi-authoritarian type of capitalism, how does international business function? What will companies do if these two systems continue? Because I think it's pretty clear now that Montesquieu was wrong, right? That international business does not, in fact, generate a single Western system, through the sweetness of commerce and all that. It actually, we're looking at a different future than what was envisioned as the spread of the Western-based system. So just at the moment, when in the liberal meritocratic capitalist countries, there's more pressure to deal with monopoly, concentration, social environmental responsibility, tax avoidance, and executive pay, shareholder control, in the political capitalist world, the pressures are actually very different. They're to deliver growth at all costs, and the concerns of the liberal meritocratic world are not central to the state's functionaries or to their elites. We don't know how this is going to evolve for the citizenry there, right? Because many of these countries are only a few decades into being plugged into global capitalism. We might add to those two capitalisms, I think, in something like a division within the global West. It's becoming less uniform. Notably, I think, the American and possibly the Anglo-American world is going one route, and Europe is going another route, meaning Europe as a kind of version of the liberal meritocratic one, but that's obviously more social democratic. Europe was, of course, a loser in the third industrial revolution. Europe's big companies are almost all second industrial revolution companies or recent mega mergers. There are no homegrown examples of companies that were started for the third IR and became world leader. There are no Facebooks, Googles, Apples, nothing, right? Let's be honest about it. It wasn't a brilliant record. But Europe's pathway is a variant where the policy effort in Europe is different from what it is, increasingly different from what it is in America and maybe in the Anglo-American world. That is, it's trying to actually perfect the vision of the liberal vision of a big market and enforcing competition rules and having an emphasis on fairness, whereas the American model is now an innovation and scale at all costs with a high tolerance for plutocracy and inequality. So a challenge to Europe then in this three system vision of the world is, how is Europe going to become a leader in the fourth industrial revolution? The European innovation system, in my opinion, is gradualist. It's challenged by fragmentation within Europe. We are still imperfectly integrated. Thin capital markets compared to the Americans or the Chinese, and a problem of scale. There's a lot of wishful thinking in policy circles, and I'm the most pro-European person here, even though I come from America. I'm proud of my French passport. And I think we don't have realism about how to make the European form of the European version of business rules function to make Europe an innovation leader, surrounded by the Americans who are going for innovation at all cost, and the Chinese who have a particular growth model that is also highly performative. I think the old states versus markets, that's the sort of paradigm of neoliberalism. They're probably displaced by two variants within liberal capitalism. Increasingly the European one versus the Anglo-American one, but they're differently active. And I think I'm channeling a colleague of ours at LSE, David Soskis, who used to talk about varieties of capitalism. I think it's become a very relevant concept. So, to conclude, global value chain unbundling, largely in the third industrial revolution, it's followed the playbook of the ICT revolution and the liberal world order. But the coming fourth industrial revolution is defined by some new conditions. First, the technology. Will the basic unbundling patterns continue, or will they go to a new stage of offshoring a lot of work in the form of basically trade by wire? Right? That's a potential of artificial intelligence that could be on the verge of happening. This could alter some of the comparative advantage of global North workers, including the skilled ones, and involve international business in a reduction of the geographical concentration of the skilled that we've been observing in the last 40 years. So that radical unbundling, which is a possibility, but I think I'm saying it's a possibility, but I'm not sure it's going to happen that way. We don't know enough about the fourth industrial revolution yet, so that's a big subject, is that unbundling would come under strain or be more shapely or more strongly shaped by the diverging rules of the three world capitalisms and the increasing strategic competition between them. It's not going to unfold under a uniform global rules order led by the West. That I think we can be pretty sure of, that's over. And I think this presents a set of intersections between economic geography, international business scholars, and political economy or institutionalist type scholars to inform public debates. I think it could be, it's a challenging world. To me, it's a little bit of a scary world sometimes, but certainly for us as scholars, these are amazing questions that we could all begin to work on, and I think they would have huge importance for the public. Thank you very much for listening to me. And I think take this. So while Simona is setting up, I'd just like to thank Michael very much for an excellent start to the session. I think each of us will now have to talk for no more than 15 minutes. Is that okay?
I will hope.
No, it's okay.
It really is a great pleasure to welcome Simona as our next contributor. She's one of my former co-authors and friend.
Yeah.
And so, get on with it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to EIBA, to John, and to Lucia for inviting me. It's a big honor. I will talk, my presentation plugs in very well, as Michael kindly reminded you, on a certain specific aspect that is monopoly power and easy interaction with agglomeration economies. I'm an economic geographer, although I've been working on international business for now 30 years since my PhD, but I consider myself an economic geographer, and so this interaction, I think, has been studied very poorly or considered maybe not too much. So 4 familiar topics. The first one is, rise in income and spatial inequality that Michael has also touched upon in his presentation quite well and historically. Agglomeration economies that are deemed to be crucial to firms' productivity, to wealth of places, and I don't have time to go through the whole production, scientific production of Michael since the 80s, and therefore I just cited some of the few most recent work to which I'm also contributed as a co-author. Michael has been not only a colleague in the same department, not only a mentor, not only a co-author, but also a friend. And this is just to remind you about Michael's legacy in international business. This was Bangalore, and we were also trying to have some Hare Krishna experience in that occasion. So we build a lot on Michael's work. Without going, and unfortunately I don't have the possibility. Linking this with monopoly, the return of monopoly, big tech, big pharma, big banks, big many things, and financialization, which is defined more broadly as, you know, the enlarged financial sector involvement in the governance of firm and in the economy more widely. So, I mean, I start precisely where Michael was also, you know, envisaging this change that came in the 80s, and considering the US case, this is a line of work, I forgot to say that, is a line of work more than a paper with Marianne Feldman and Frederick Guy. So we started with this quotation, Hillary Clinton in Mumbai, 2018. I want the places that own 2/3 of American gross domestic product. I want the places that are optimistic, diverse, dynamic, moving forward. In his whole campaign, Make America Great Again, was looking backwards. So let's look backwards. This is the distribution of the top 20 earnings employment in the US in 1980 by commuting zone. So it's really the proportion, the top 20 above the national 80th percentile. And you can see, I mean, that the biggest concentration of well-paid jobs were particularly in Gary, Indiana, a strong manufacturing center, steel center at that time, Detroit, Washington, D.C., I mean, and a few others. Then, if we switch to the Clinton-Trump contest, we see always, these are commuting zones, so 709 US commuting zone. We can see that the picture is very different. We see that San Francisco, San Jose, Washington, D.C. is still there, but in general, the whole area of the Middle West has lost. In fact, if we look at the change, we can see, I mean, some places have become, for sure, optimistic, diverse, dynamic, moving forward, and we can see this big concentration basically on the West Coast, San Francisco, Bay Area, and San Jose, San Diego, and, I mean, you can see the old manufacturing core around Detroit, Chicago, going completely down and losing well-paid jobs. There is something there nearby Houston, Austin, and San Antonio as big tech centers. And on the east side, we see basically, you know, Boston, New York in particular, relying on the huge growth of salaries in the financial sector due to deregulation, and then Charlotte, banking in North Carolina, and the research triangle again in North Carolina. So we see a completely different picture. So agglomeration economies, in economic geography we have two types of agglomeration economies: localization economies, Marshallian forces. Urbanization tells us the bigger and more diverse, the better. And all this has been obviously related to also globalization processes, the importance of global production networks, global value chains, increased specialization that has been, in a way, feeding back and forth with these agglomeration economies. The reasons are well known to this audience, from technological to reduced communication and transport cost, regulation internationally, reduced regulation and tariff barriers, and spatial concentration, not only of industries in localized agglomeration economies, Marshallian types, but also agglomeration of functions in large cities in particular. So if we actually look at the technology and business structure of nowadays, we see this rising new network industry and platform monopoly strategies, and the two of, these externalities coming from network interact with agglomeration economies. So monopoly is increasing returns internal to firms, interacting with the increasing returns external to the firm and actually attributed to places normally. So this has been amplified by our third factor, financialization, and the institutional changes connected. So changes in antitrust, doctrine, Chicago School, Bork interpretation of the monopoly intended just when it harms consumers, and therefore from then a sort of diminishing antitrust intervention, deregulation mostly in old network industries, and expanded intellectual property right. This is just borrowed from economists, orthodox economists, Egerton and others, that have done a fantastic work to show the rise of markup over time, precisely the same time we were indicating with Michael, right? So this network's externality, just let's think about, Google, Facebook, this is Financial Times, they call the duopoly, digital duopoly, okay, that is in the advertising business, or Amazon dominance and the suppliers more and more, depending on Amazon, that in any case the only one that controls consumers and have information on consumers. Now, all this obviously is not new. We know that these networks and platform-based monopolies is something that we saw in the past. Let's think about, since the beginning of the 20th century, water, railroad, roads, and electricity grids. What has changed is the geography of, and these were all regulated, okay? They were either state-owned or state-regulated until 1980s. Now, the fact that changes the geography, because in that case, if you have an electricity grid, that kind of geographical extension of the monopoly was, in a way, superimpressing the geography of the monopoly service. So if you have a grid of electricity, obviously it's gonna cover the assets of the monopoly itself. While nowadays, these companies, particularly in the ICT, so the third revolution going into the fourth industrial revolution with artificial intelligence and digitalization, we see that there is no correspondence any longer between the control of the monopoly and its geographical extent, because this is global. And in fact, states that own, in a way, these companies have very little incentive to regulate again, because they act as export industries for the country itself. So all this is also obviously interact and in a way amplified by the functions and the investment in foreign direct investment by multinational corporations. These are just a few maps. We had 1 million at the moment. I mean, I just put some that shows headquarters there, R&D versus manufacturing. These are FDI from the rest of the world in the period cumulated FDI between 2003 and 2017. So we see particularly R&D is highly concentrated in the same places, the same suspected places, let's say. In the US, I mean, this is another way to look at monopoly. This is a market valuation of the horizontal axis scaled by GDP and employees. And what we see is that in the US, the big in 2016 have higher market valuation, at the same time much lower employment. In 1976, the red circles and the red companies, let's say, the two with highest market valuation were in any case network-based, network product company, AT&T and IBM. And, you know, so this network story, network platform-based monopolies, you can see that is still there. This is another measure of monopoly, and which is quite used, is a proxy for monopoly, is the ratio between market value, so basically, I mean, how much a company obviously is evaluated on the stock market, so these are only listed company, to book asset, book value of intangible and tangible assets owned by the company. And the higher this ratio, obviously, the higher the barriers, the entry barriers, so the more monopoly you can see. And you can see here we have a lot of empty places, obviously, because we considered only the commuting zones with 5 or more non-financial firms that are on the stock market. You can see that, I mean, the growth of this monopoly measure is in fact concentrated again in the same places. So monopoly firms and agglomeration economies. I mean, when agglomeration economies actively interact with monopoly, these external rewards, external returns to technological clusters interact and amplify these internalized increasing returns at the firm level. For example, amplification of agglomeration productivity advantage, what Michael was saying before, winner takes all, the best talent, the top 20% that I was showing in the map, the latest information, the latest knowledge. I mean, the area of San Francisco is a very well-studied and very clear example of that. Markets for startup. Again, you know, we all know, I mean, I spend a lot of time in San Francisco for personal reasons. I mean, the startups that are mushrooming there are actually there just with one thing in mind, to be acquired, right? And Google, Apple, Facebook, obviously, I mean, the aim is either to eat or to kill, okay? Proximity to venture capital, you can see the venture capital is again concentrating in this few locations, and then we have the finance that I won't have time to go into finance and the big contribution that finance gives to this interaction between monopoly and agglomeration economies, but inflows of capital is going to monopoly firms and places, because these are obviously the firms with higher returns. And this on the financial market means that is basically drags away resources from the lower returns and more competitive sectors that are based obviously elsewhere, right? Monopoly of finance, we calculated just, I mean, as a preliminary idea, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, by commuting zone again. I cannot show you the map because, I mean, too many maps, but U.S. commercial banking, between 1994 and 2008, and it grew not only for deposit, but grew impressively for assets. So, I mean, we know from the literature, financial, economic geography literature, that post-recession bank closure disproportionately in small, medium-sized cities and rural areas. In fact, I mean, there is this a way to call them banking deserts. So, what is the argument here is that economic development policy, something that we are both collaborating a lot with Michael and the European Commission in order to, plan something different that can really address the problem of the places left behind. However, we still implicitly treat agglomeration economies and the resulting localized increasing returns as an attribute of place, without considering that these are also feeding in particular place, the firms and the monopoly that they represent. This is particularly evident in the case of the US, as Michael was saying before, is slightly less evident on the European scale, but cities like London, cities like Amsterdam or Frankfurt or Paris could actually represent on a possibly smaller scale exactly the same phenomenon. So in the economic geography literature, these myths like Silicon Valley story, right? Agglomeration of techno monopolies, more than representing a sort of model for policy making, which has been largely the case over the last 20-30 years, are actually holding back other places and regions by appropriating revenues which are a tax on business, not only in other parts of the country but in other parts of the world, restricting use of basic knowledge and thus downgrading capability. I mean, Google and Microsoft, locking some part of this digital platform in order to extract rents, or even Airbnb or Booking.com that are actually extracting 15 to 25, 30% from individual, small businesses or just simply owner of flats without actually creating any value whatsoever. And in the financial sector, partnering with the financial sector, diverting capital for possible alternative investment in other firms, in other regions, with a more competitive structure. In spatial terms, obviously, this redistributes income and wealth across the world and disproportionately, concentrated in a few places. This is work in progress. The future agenda now, we are trying to go into large databases for proving, testing econometrically this relationship that at the moment are depicted in a way, a bit in an impressionistic way. More work is needed, and obviously is needed at the intersection between, as Michael was pointing out, economic geography, international business, political economy, because the future is interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, because otherwise we miss obviously aspects of this interdependent phenomena. And so I'm really here to say let's work together, because this world, Michael said I'm a bit scared. I am more than a bit scared, and therefore I think that our communities together could make a difference. Thank you very much. Oh yeah, of course. I'm not used to have this thing because I normally have a very loud voice.
Yeah, right. Oh, there we go. Oh, it's there. There we are.
I try to squeeze it at the moment.
Good. Good. Thank you. Okay. Okay, I'd like to pick up, if I may, with one of Michael's central themes, which was the relationship between the shift of paradigm over time and economic geography in terms of international business distribution, and particularly in relation to international business knowledge networks. So I would argue that there are essentially been three of these major paradigms. Michael was mentioning the subsequent two of the three, the first being the mechanical, going back to the original Industrial Revolution in Britain. So essentially we have the mechanical age, science-based mass production age, and now the information age. And international business in each of these paradigms has functioned in rather different ways. So in the first paradigm it was predominantly one of international trade, arm's-length markets, and resource-seeking multinational companies and foreign direct investment. In the second phase, that especially has been contributed to by people like Mira Wilkins, Al Chandler and so on, emphasis more on managerial coordination in large multinational companies and the substantial growth of market-seeking types of investment, and now a more internationally networked form of international business, which is predominantly more knowledge-seeking than in the past. And in the process, with respect to economic geography, I would suggest that in the information age, in this latest third paradigm, the nature of the global-local relationship has been transformed to become very much closer. So the global has become much more interconnected with the local in ways that both Simona and Michael, I think, have been describing in detail. So in other words, we see a major shift in spatial distribution of international business activity as each new industrial age has come into existence, and that in the latest phase of this, in the information age, those that are internationally connected have benefited to a much greater extent than in the past. So if we were to take Simona's quote of, the dynamic areas, for example, in America versus the non-dynamic, we would find also that those more dynamic areas are much more internationally connected. Places like where I live now, New York, or where Michael's from, San Francisco, are much more interconnected than other places in the world. So urban areas in general have tended to gain relative to non-urban areas, but so too, as we will see, and as Michael has emphasised, some urban areas have fared much better than others. So in the information age, there's been a substantial rise in international knowledge flows or connectivity, which has widened this general structure of connectivity across places. That's the kind of globalization story in a way. Some emerging market cities are now more important nodes in international knowledge networks, and we'll see some data in a moment. And the overall international knowledge network has therefore become much denser in nature. It's grown, it's intensified, and local and global linkages have become ever more interconnected with one another. And we have some econometric work that has shown just this. So this is our overall intercity knowledge network based on patent citation data, and you'll see how now some of these emerging market cities are coming in, like Sao Paulo, Mumbai, and relatively central Seoul, which has grown dramatically in the last 40, 50 years. And so the nature of this network has been transforming over time in terms of the relationships between cities. So what we're doing here, and this is work that I've been doing and it's based on the dissertation of Salma Zaman, and here's her chapter at the end in a recent book that we've done on paradigm change and innovation systems. We're examining patent citations of a network of inventors in 62 major worldwide cities using metropolitan areas. And we've selected these cities from a database of global world cities, but we've selected those that have sufficiently high threshold of patent numbers, both in absolute terms and in relative terms relative to country size, to make sure, for instance, that we don't just select American cities. Anyway, these are the overall results in terms of the changes. Who's been gaining most and who's been losing most in terms of city ranks. So of the city ranks, they're
from 1 to 62 in the aggregate, we can see that from this information age era, from the early 80s through to the 2010s, the cities that have gained most in rank in terms of their relevance within the international knowledge network as measured by patent citations are, the first four are essentially emerging market cities: Seoul, Taipei, Guangzhou and Bangalore, and two American cities, Seattle and Austin. So we see, for example, that Seoul has gone up mainly from around the mid-50s in terms of rank, in other words, very much towards the bottom of the distribution in the early 1980s, to somewhere near the top of the distribution, somewhere between 9 and 18 by the end of the period. These three categories, we're essentially looking at knowledge sourcing, so that means you're more likely as a city to be cited by other cities. Recipient means you're taking more knowledge from the rest of the world, so you're citing more knowledge from elsewhere in the world. And influence is essentially a measure of network centrality. So in terms of network centrality, we're measuring the relative significance of a location within the overall network. And you can see that actually it doesn't make much difference which of these measures you use. They're all pretty compatible. Now, if we then go on to the main losers, which illustrates Michael's point about Europe losing out in this third industrial revolution, these are all European cities that have lost most. Two of them in the UK, Manchester and Birmingham, and others from Düsseldorf, Rome, Oslo and Basel. Now, if we look at what's been going on, because we can break it down by technological field, so if we look just at the ICT fields, the immediate effect of the ICT revolution, we can find, if we compare these with the gainers overall of the network, we find essentially that the emerging market cities were gainers not just in the overall structure of networks, but in ICT in particular. In other words, as Michael was suggesting, a great deal of this emergence of the emerging markets had to do with their take-up of ICT, their successful take-up of ICT. You'll see, incidentally, how we don't now list Seattle or Austin. So the Seattle and Austin story is a different one. But where you have the growth to prominence of the emerging market cities, it's connected to the ICT revolution directly. Then the losers. So Manchester and Birmingham have lost in ICT just as they've lost overall. But some of those other European cities I've mentioned, they were never much in ICT in the first place, so they don't feature so much in terms of losses. So the European cities, there are some differences. Vienna and Brussels have lost relatively more in position in terms of the ICT fields and have fallen down the ranking. So some summary network indicators. Some cities have remained central. I didn't mention those because I was looking mainly at changes. San Francisco Bay Area, New York City, Tokyo. These cities remain highly ranked throughout. The main emerging market gainers have taken advantage of the window of opportunity offered by paradigm change or shift and have established themselves in the ICT fields. Of the main losers in Europe, those that have, there are essentially three categories of losers in Europe. There are those that have lost most in the ICT fields, like Vienna, those that have lost most in non-ICT fields, like Düsseldorf, and those that have lost in both, like Manchester or Birmingham. As in Europe, American cities were major gainers in the ICT fields. No US cities were major gainers, but there were some established cities like San Francisco Bay that remained dominant in the ICT fields. The main gainers in America in non-ICT networks like Seattle is in chemical fields and in Austin in the mechanical and transport fields. So some innovative cities rose in Asia and the United States for slightly different reasons. Middle ranking cities in Europe, there was a number of them that actually declined, which relates, I think, to the spatial point that Michael was making about differences in Europe and the United States. So just in summary, I think this very much confirms the idea that was advanced by Michael in some of his earlier work in urban studies that looked at relatively unevenness of this distribution of city growth and decline, and some of these middle-ranking cities that either did very well or very poorly by comparison with those that remained highly ranked. Okay, I will conclude there now and invite Lucia to the stage. Put this on.
Be quick.
Yeah. There you go. I'll set you. This one. Like that.
Yes, this one. Okay, so good morning. Of course, I'm trying to be quicker than I expected to be. So my presentation really nicely fits, I think, with the let's say the panel, but especially with the last one, as the focus of my presentation and the keywords will actually be the following. ICT revolution, meaning the third industrial revolution. Michael talked about third industrial revolution. Divergence, although I'm going to talk about divergence in a rather different way. And complexity, of course. Whenever we talk about globalization, we talk about complexity. I mean, the interconnectedness is by definition complexity. So the main messages in particular I'd like to emphasize are the following. So the first one is that whenever we talk about knowledge creation processes, we have to rely upon two different processes going on jointly. That is not only let's say, the fact that knowledge creation relies on different technological fields, of course, but also different innovation systems, meaning locations. And this is where the presentation really links to the previous ones. And the second message is that the third industrial revolution, meaning the ICT paradigm, actually has brought about a divergence in these forms of knowledge sourcing complexity. This means, in particular, that if we consider ICTs, they are actually responsible for, we know, on the one hand, increasing modularization and locational specialization by definition. But at the same time, ICTs facilitate, as we know, new knowledge combinations, and therefore what we do expect in principle is that both the cross-field and the cross-location components of knowledge creation processes do increase. But what we claim in this work is that, in fact, if we consider the impact of ICTs on the cross-technological fields process and the cross-location knowledge sourcing, what we see is a divergence. I'm trying to be clear. So why what we call the tandem of knowledge creation? Because, I mean, understanding, of course, knowledge creation processes within and between companies, within and across spatial borders within and across industries, has been at the core, at the heart of research, not only in IB. But some research has recently emphasized that actually the scope for global value creation by connecting geographically distant knowledge sources for innovation are characterized also by distant knowledge recombinations. So the idea is that if we think of the networks that John has presented, we really have to look at two underlying dimensions there. That is not only a dimension of cross-technological fields, but also cross-location complexity. So what we saw in the, let's say, networks, let's say, illustrated before is just the cross-locational complexity, but there is also cross-technological fields complexity going on. So, concerning the role on the ICTs, on the technological complexity, we know, I mean, already quite a lot about that. We know that ICTs have facilitated the technological fusion, the recombination of formerly distant branches of technology, that ICTs have facilitated technological variety, technological diversification. And so we expect the increasing complexity in the cross-technological fields dimension of knowledge sourcing. But how about ICTs and geographic specialization and therefore cross-location knowledge complexity? So our claim here is that ICTs are actually reducing, in a way, cross-location knowledge complexity. And that has very much to do with what we heard in the previous presentations, meaning the increasing specialization of places, the increasing concentrations, the increasing monopoly. So the idea, I'm going quick here, but the idea is that ICTs allow, on the one hand, as I said, the increasing interconnectedness between specialized poles, specialized places, specialized nodes, but at the same time, what happens is that these nodes become increasingly, let's say, concentrated, and therefore the, let's say, complexity in terms of cross-location decreases. This is just from MIT Technology Review. This is the World Innovation Clusters. This is 2013. Of course, if we update these maps, we will find what John, for example, was showing about the role of new poles, new centers in this map. So the idea, therefore, is that in the third industrial revolution, when ICTs play a role, the cross-location dimension of knowledge creation decreases in terms of complexity. So our proposition, therefore, are very, let's say, straightforward from what I just said. That is, when we consider the role of ICTs, that is, we consider the third industrial revolution stage, we expect that the higher the share of ICTs within knowledge accumulation, the more positive is the impact on the cross-field, cross-technological field knowledge complexity, and this impact increases over time. While on the contrary, we foresee a negative impact on the cross-location knowledge complexity. I'm not spending any second on the, let's say, empirical part. We developed, by the way, this is a joint work with John Cantwell and Jessica Salmon. We developed some measures and some econometric analysis based on patent data and measurement of complexity. I'm not going to explain in details, but what we find is that, in fact, the impact of the ICTs is really clearly positive on the cross-field dimension of knowledge complexity, while is clearly negative when we consider the cross-location knowledge complexity. So I'd really like to conclude, in order to allow some final minutes for discussion. I'd like to conclude just emphasizing that what we find, what we claim is that the ICT paradigm is stimulating, has stimulated a divergence in what we see has processes of knowledge creation. But of course, I'd like also to emphasize that, and this is also what has been emphasized at the end of Michael's presentation, and also Simona, that if we consider the fourth industrial revolution, so the increasing and the advance in digital technologies and let's say blockchains. We talked yesterday in a panel on the global value chains, possible changes, of course, stemming from the fourth industrial revolution. We expect that these new technologies are really likely to be disruptive and pose new challenges, of course, not only to firms, but also to all of us as researchers. So thank you. Sorry, I try
Yeah, you could give some concluding. So I think we have no time for questions from the floor or general discussion, but I would like to ask Michael, if he would, to say a few final words or to respond.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, I personally was sitting there on my phone taking notes on all these presentations because what I find interesting is that we did not coordinate our presentations, although I knew of Simona's paper, so that's a bit of prior information. But I think there's what I see in this panel is some very interesting common and overlapping developments. So that's kind of always an interesting moment in a field when we, each in our own way, move toward some issues that are interconnected. And are clearly the, I mean, I guess we're self-selected here, but there's a really strong element here, I think, of this duality of localization and globalization going on. There's a temporal dimension of these different industrial revolutions. There's the change in the ways that innovation occurs within and between places, these kind of new, like what Lucia would say, these new recombinatorial elements that are changing the two distributions of between and within. And of course, there's the turbulence kinds of issues that John is raising about that within the general tendency for metropolitanization to dominate the process, there's a turbulence in the rank of cities. The kind of the actual who wins and who loses, and that has to do with, of course, wider forces and development. And then I think threading throughout this the kinds of broader political economy issues that we've also in our own ways tried to raise. So all I can say is I think we're sort of designing a set of topics here that are challenging but very rich. And what I want is 100 really good PhD students to do them. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, Michael. I think in view of the time, we will have to now conclude the session because it is time for lunch. So we will actually be formally awarding Michael with the honorary fellowship this evening at the gala dinner, so we'll have another chance to speak to him then. Thank you.